Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Maxwell Stearns. Max is professor of law at the Carey School of Law at the University of Maryland. Main interests are in constitutional law and the law with economics. He has a bachelor's from University of Pennsylvania and his JD from University of Virginia. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about what are the potential changes to the Constitution. We talk about the general narrative that we have about the U.S. Constitution as, we're, in school here in the U.S. and what we learn about it and why some of the standard narrative is not the complete picture. We give an overview of his proposed reforms, talk about third parties as spoilers, generational shifting of parties, and some of the history of political parties in the 19th century in the U.S. We also talk about positive versus negative rights, gerrymandering. We kind of do a little bit of the world tour of how other systems have kind of a parliamentary feature. And we talk about Germany's mixed member proportionality, problems with ranked choice voting, and many other topics. This was such a blast. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Max is obviously lovely, super brilliant. And it's an important conversation because as we talk about in the conversation, the Constitution is a document. It's got its flaws, it's got its issues, and we should be pushing to continue to reform it and make it better, just like every other country does in the world. So important conversation, and he's just wonderful at this topic. You can find this conversation and all others at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there, like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends. All of that's much appreciated. And now I bring you Maxwell Stearns. I am here with Maxwell Stearns. Max, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. You've written a really, really thought-provoking and wonderful book, which I really enjoyed. I really liked wrestling with all these ideas and thinking about many things. And so we're going to talk all about it. The book is called Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. That's a great subtitle, by the way.
Thank you.
And I'm very, very excited about this. So before we get into all the details, why don't you tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, just a kind of quick snapshot of you.
So again, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to do this. So I am a law professor at the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law.
Go Terps. Go Terps.
I've been teaching law since 1992. I've been an attorney. I was an attorney practicing before that. But I primarily teach in two areas: constitutional law and the economic analysis of law. And I kind of reside as an academic where those two areas, one's more of a methodology than a doctrinal area, the other one's more of a doctrinal area than a methodology. Where those things overlap, that tends to be where, for most of my career, I hang out and think about the implications of one for the other.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so obviously, constitutional law is up your alley. So writing about the Constitution, different aspects of it is great. So the first question I wanna just kind of start with is I read this book recently, actually, which is on my mind, which sort of ties in. It's by Aziz Rana. And I'm drawing a blank on the name of the book, but it's about the Constitution. And he talks about the Constitution and why it's kind of failed many people. It is one of the ones on my list.
Yeah,
it's a big boy. It is a big boy. And it's interesting. I'd be curious for your thoughts on it at some point. I think you'd like a lot of it. But the question that I have from your book and someone from that book as well is, many people will kind of laud our system of government, democracy, the Constitution, how we do things in the United States, this kind of patriotism or healthy nationalism, if you will, especially when we look at other modern systems around the world. How does that sit with you? And I mean, we'll talk about how there's many broken pieces of the system, but in terms of how the country was founded and created, and how we created all these things with the Constitution, it's not perfect, but there's this kind of worship of the Constitution in that time. And while there are many nice things about it, there are many flawed things about it. What's the kind of the kind of 30,000-foot view here, when people look at the Constitution and how the country is founded? What's your kind of lens that you're seeing it through?
So what I would say is that most of us in our childhoods, middle school and high school, were raised on a notion of American exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. We were taught this idea that the American Constitution has lasted longer than the written Constitution of any other nation around the world. And the implication that went with that lesson that so many of us carry is that must necessarily imply that when these folks met in Philadelphia, originally to revise the Articles of Confederation, which they ditched in favor of writing a new document, the Constitution, they must have brought with them an eminent wisdom and soundness. It must be the case that there was a brilliance, a wisdom, a foresight that was unique to that collection of individuals writing the document that we have. And this is what I'll refer to as the American exceptionalism story of American constitutionalism, which I think is resonant of the question that you've asked. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's a mistake. I think that one of the things that we as Americans need to do is open our eyes to the idea that the lessons of our childhood may be incorrect, that there may be other reasons why the United States survived, thrived, emerged the largest, most powerful economy in the world, the dominant superpower in the world, may have been for reasons that were in spite of, not because of the original constitutional design, may have been because of unique historical factors. For example, the fact that we, unlike European nations or South American nations or African nations or even Asian nations, are highly geographically isolated for a long period of time from foreign military threats, that we had the original sin of bringing enslaved persons to the United States, maintaining them under brutal conditions for centuries, that we had the capacity for westward expansion, admittedly at terrible cost to Native American communities, but we also just had a constant influx of highly motivated immigrants that helped, again, to drive our economy. And it may be that it's because of that combination of historical reasons that we've thrived, and in spite of, not because of the constitutional design, which never worked the way the framers believed it was going to work. And I know we'll get into some of those details in our conversation.
When I hear people, kind of mention or highlight some of the flaws, or we have an incomplete story of how we learned in, high school or whatever, a lot of people resist this as, some people go so far as to say it's un-American, it's unpatriotic. Oh, what's the incentive here? Why are you trying to always, why are historians or writers always trying to change our history? It's fine the way it is. These kind of claims. And I can hear some of it. I'm not sure why people are so resistant, as if we have a history that's always going to stay that way. Like, we can't do more research, we can't do more investigation into different stories and narratives, and that might change the bigger one. I'm not really sure why people resist that too much. But I guess just briefly, what would you say to people that kind of push back against that and say, Max, you're just, I don't know what you're drinking or what you're smoking, but that's not true. This is a great country, and they were true patriots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would be your kind of response to some of those people?
Well, I can say that there are many things about our history that are great, right? Without the United States, we wouldn't have ended fascism in World War II. The world would have a very different map. It would be a very different place. It would be a much worse place. We ultimately expanded the categories of individuals to whom we expanded rights, despite the fact that within the original Constitution, without ever mentioning slavery, we codified the institution of slavery. And hard for me to imagine that anybody thoughtful about American history would say that's a good thing. It took us a very long time, despite the fact that we fought a civil war and we had Reconstruction, because of the premature end of Reconstruction, it took almost a century before the Reconstruction amendments took meaningful effect. And efforts to suppress minority participation continued to endure and still continue to endure. It took even longer to give women the right to vote. Now, of course, we're not alone in the world this way. I mean, women and minorities have been denied rights in societies as long as mankind began forming into societies, and there were in-groups and out-groups. I don't say that everything we've done is wrong by any stretch. Actually, I'll just say, one of the very interesting blurbs that, on the very back of my book, I wouldn't ordinarily read this, but my book is described as a clear, earnest, and patriotic argument for parliamentary democracy in America. I don't think that those who know me would regard me in any way as unpatriotic or un-American. Actually, I wrote this book because I'm committed to the project of American democracy, not because I'm here to denigrate American democracy. I think the world is a better place with a robust American democracy. And I think the goal is to make sure that our children and future generations have a thriving democracy. We're really at risk of losing it. I mean, the dedication of my book is very simple: to my children and yours. I wrote this out of a place of love and patriotism for this country. But I think that doesn't mean that I have to close my eyes to the defects in our system that are putting us on a path that could actually end the capacity of future generations to live in America as a thriving democracy.
Yeah, I'm glad you answered that, because it's really important, because there's you have some really interesting ideas and kind of throw some really wonderful suggestions for how to do things. And so I want listeners to capture that at the front end of this is the intention. I think intentions are important with people, especially if they have different ideas. So I'm glad that you said that up front. Okay, so tell us the kind of thumbnail, I guess, sketch of your book. There are two. There's some proposals you have, which we'll get into the details, but just give us the layout of this. You have some changes to the House of Representatives and executive accountability. So why, when you looked at some of the reform or how we could change some things for the better, why did you put it on these kind of two features for big change? And again, just kind of set the table a little bit for the Electoral College. I do really want to get your thoughts on Electoral College reform or abolishment. Is some interesting ideas there. So yeah, tell us about the proposals, the two big proposals you make in the book.
So let me just lead with a very brief synopsis of the diagnostic, because
please.
Otherwise the cure may not be properly contextualized.
Yeah.
The problem that we're facing is that we have a two-party system in which the centers or modes, if you will, of those parties, especially since the beginning of the information age, which I'll put at the beginning of the early to mid 1990s, have grown and are growing increasingly far apart. And the parties are increasingly hostage to the most extreme demands of their base. That is leading to a profound dysfunction. And we can talk about how we got there. There are very specific reasons we got there in the information age. And I know we'll talk about that. But what that means is that the way to fix the crisis we're facing is to figure out how to break the two-party duopoly and how to prevent this ongoing trend of the two centers moving further and further apart. And the way to do this is to replace the duopoly with robust party competition, however, subject to a caveat. And the caveat is that there are two threats to democracy. One is when you have too few parties like we have. The opposite threat is when you have hyper-fragmented parties. So the goal is to create more parties than two, but not so many more parties that you have hyper-fragmentation. And we could talk about why it is that those two seemingly opposite dynamics actually pose similar threats to democracy. So I propose 3 amendments that will achieve breaking the two-party duopoly in this trend line, which is amply documented. This is not subjective. Pew Research Center has amply documented this, of the two parties moving further and further apart. So I've got 3 amendments. One operates on a system called Mixed Member Proportionality. It doubles the size of the House of Representatives, and each individual citizen will cast 2 ballots, one in a district, just like we do now, one by party. We will use the party votes on a state-by-state basis to achieve proportional representation by state. And then the second, which is the most radical of my 3 radical amendments, uses a system of coalition bargaining among the top 5 parties until a majority coalition forms. And then the party that succeeds in forming a coalition will have its pre-designated slate for president and vice president assume those offices on the same fixed calendar we have now, with a backstop to avoid some of the problems that many parliamentary democracies have of just keep voting, but never forming a government. So we will stay on the calendar that we have now. The 3rd amendment creates a mechanism for the removal of a deeply problematic and dysfunctional president through a vote of no confidence based on maladministration, subject to a 60% vote in the House of Representatives. So what this does is it creates, unlike what we have now, a genuine place for third parties to form, to emerge, and to thrive. Because now, in my system, unlike the system we have, when you vote for a third party, you're no longer voting for a spoiler or what I call a randomizer. You're no longer punished for voting for a third party. That third party can form part of the government and, in doing so, demand concessions from the party that leads the coalition and might get cabinet positions, might get policy concessions, might even get appointments to the Supreme Court. And so suddenly, rather than being punished for supporting a third party, you're rewarded for supporting a third party. There is a genuine place for third parties to emerge and thrive, which is the difficulty in our present system. There's no place for third parties other than as spoilers or randomizers.
Yeah, so much to mine there. I mean, I think the idea of the House of Representatives being 870 members just sounds, I know it sounds wild for me because it's all I've known is 434 or 5, whatever we have. So it's, we'll come to it. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, and we should talk about that because it's very, very important for your listeners to understand how even with 870 members, we will have a higher constituent to representative ratio than most democracies in the world, except possibly India. I mean, it is in fact the case that we have an egregiously undersized House of Representatives. But I also want to say that the 870 will not be fixed by the Constitution. What will be fixed, if my amendments are enacted, is the ratio of districted to non-districted seats. Congress can, by statute, just as it can now, change the size of Congress. The benefit of the 870 is that unlike every other proposal for reform that's out there, it allows every sitting member of the House and Senate to remain an incumbent in their existing district or state. It creates the capacity for political buy-in by those that matter the most because they've got blocking power for reform. Yeah,
that's very, very actually important to mention. So we'll come to that, but so let's go back a little bit in time because there's, for many historians at the very least, the election of 1800 is pretty wild. Jefferson was pretty shrewd, to say the least, in that election. We have a two-party system in the United States, and that is not necessarily common. I mean, when we look at, anytime I look at the news and I say, oh, there's an election in Germany or in France or, United Kingdom or whatever. And it's just like, oh, they got all these, building a coalition and building all these parties. And it's just so different in some ways from the United States. But some people might not know this. The United States wasn't founded by the founder, Washington, Adams, Madison, Jefferson, to be a two-party system. They wanted it to be more. That's pretty well noted. But interestingly, by the fourth election, so the election of 1800 between Jefferson and Adams, it falls into these basically two parties. And then there's certain offshoots, you had the Whig Party and, you have other parties that pop up here and there, but nothing really that was like the two major parties. And we've basically had two parties since. And so you're wanting to, I think rightfully so, push for, multiple parties and, not too many, but multiple parties, maybe a type of coalition. Okay. In the United States, so we'll look at other countries and how other people do it, which some really good ideas in other places, actually. But how could we change realistically if we've been doing something since our fourth presidential election in this country, and we're very stubborn and we get stuck in how we want to do things? How is it that we could actually have more than a two-party system, that we could push towards maybe a parliamentary system, if it's basically been a two-party system in presidential elections since the start?
So first, let me say how we can't.
Okay. That's good.
Because a lot of people hold the intuition that it's really just the voters that are the problem. If they would just support third parties, whatever we want to call them, right? We can call them forward, we can call them no names, we can call them independent.
Right.
People would just get out of their psychological commitment to two parties, we could have more than two parties. That is a profound mistake. The reason we have a two-party system is because of the institutions that the framers of the Constitution put in place and that evolved over time to entrench two parties. In fact, we can go back before the fourth election, even before 1800, it was more or less already evolving to a two-party system. Really what the 1800 election did, for your audience members who are fans of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, there's actually a wonderful scene that really captures actual history, right? The one who tried to be shrewd in that election, because that was an election where no candidate captured a majority of votes in the Electoral College. It was the first of only two elections to go to the House of Representatives, and it took 36 rounds before before Jefferson actually succeeded in getting a majority, with the help, ironically, of Alexander Hamilton, who was himself a Federalist, whereas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. But going into that election, there's a couple of things that most people don't understand, right? You had a Federalist president, you had John Adams, and you had Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. They were leaders of opposite parties and as president and vice president. That's unimaginable today, right? I mean, it's unimaginable that the president and vice president would be at each other's throats politically. Later on, they made up and became friends again. They had been friends before, they become friends again, but now they are rivals. And the other candidate, who is really supposed to be Jefferson's vice presidential candidate, is Aaron Burr. He's the one who tried to be shrewd because the system at the time didn't have a mechanism for a different category of vote for the vice president. So he tried to be opportunistic and become president as opposed to Jefferson's vice president. The scene in Hamilton is when, after that gets defeated, Burr goes up to Jefferson and says, sort of makes a loyalty pledge. And Jefferson says, yeah, I'm on to you. I don't trust you at all, and I'm going to fix this thing. And he does. The 12th Amendment allows the president to choose a vice president and run on a slate. Basically, the 12th Amendment, and keep in mind, the first 10 amendments are right off the bat. right? Literally the first order of Congress. The 11th Amendment has to do with a strange thing, state sovereign immunity. The 12th Amendment's really early in our history. Right off the bat, the 12th Amendment is an acknowledgement that the Constitution doesn't work the way the framers thought it was going to work. The framers thought that they had gotten rid of a system that they called factions, or we call parties, because we're going to have these never-ending rivalries among the branches of government. But what the 12th Amendment recognizes is no. We have a two-party system. And the two-party system arises because we have direct election of the president filtered through the Electoral College, but it requires a majority of votes to win. And in that scheme, people realize that the winning strategy is to keep your side together and fracture the opposition. The other side realizes the same thing, keep our side together, fracture the opposition. This leads to two separate parties. This plays out in the Senate by the 1840s when we have single-member districts in the House, plays out in the House. We have built into our system, hardwired into our system, a two-party system. And what that means is that the only way out of the two-party system is to re-hardwire the system. In other words, it's not just a question of wanting to have third parties. You have to have institutions that allow third parties to emerge and flourish. And we can't do it in the system we have now. There's no space for them other than as spoilers or randomizers.
I guess the follow-up there is why. Most Americans don't know the 12th Amendment, which is maybe unfortunate. But I guess why do we not know that as much, right? Why are we putting the quote unquote blame or the impetus on the voter? That's not to say that the voter has no role to play here, but why are we not trying to focus on institutions? Is it just folks that are there, they like to just keep the status quo so they can keep doing things they want to do? Or what do you think is kind of, animating people's kind of ignorance on this or not knowing some of these things?
I think it goes back to this American exceptionalism in our childhood. We have been taught this, and it forms part of our sense of core identity, that there's something almost mystical, almost religious about our Constitution. And one of the central reasons I wrote this book is because it's really important for Americans to become more thoughtful about the fact that we can say there have been many good things that have emerged from the system we have, but there have been problems too, and those problems aren't just of recent vintage. I mean, you can go back to George Washington's farewell address, lamented the rising partisanship that he was experiencing. The Constitution never worked the way the framers thought it was going to work. And this is evident in all kinds of ways, right? The rivalries they envisioned were among the institutions, the three branches of government. But the real rivalries in our politics aren't so much across institutions as across parties, where some members of Congress become defenders of the president of their parties, challengers of the president when the president is from the other party. The rivalries are party rivalries, partisan rivalries, much more so than institutional rivalries. And that has given rise to dysfunction. We have managed this system for other reasons reasonably well for a couple of hundred years, but for very specific reasons, the system began to break down in quite significant ways in the information age. And it's really important for people to understand that the things they learned as children may not be true. There may be better ways to do democracy. And one of the things I'll just say, I wrote this book not for an academic audience. I wrote this book to be accessible to people with a variety of backgrounds. I use familiar cultural references. I take readers on a virtual world tour. I use childhood games to convey concepts. It's really important that people understand the problem we're facing, because if they don't understand the problem, they can't understand why some claimed solutions aren't going to work, whereas others, like the ones that I include in this book, can and will.
Well, I think the really nice thing that you're doing is you're very practically and tangibly giving a solution. Look, maybe people like it, maybe they don't, okay, but you're giving legitimate, realistic, this isn't some idealistic pie in the sky, like, very, very much, attainable solutions, which I think is great, because it's one of the things I like about the book, is because you hear so many people complain and this and that, and it's like, well, what's your solution, or do you have a viable option here? I mean, anybody can complain about something, and so I think this is one of the great things here. So about third parties, you mentioned it in the book, obviously a lot, but how we know it now, as you mentioned it a bit earlier, we usually see third parties as the spoiler, right? As the someone that comes in and takes the 6% of the vote and then throws it to the other one of the two major candidates. Obviously, Ross Perot is huge in '92. I guess some people, I don't know, people I guess fight about this. Some people say that's what gave Clinton the election. Who knows? Maybe you have thoughts on that. And then 2000 as well. And let's see how it turns out. RFK Jr. appears to be getting on a lot of ballots in many states. So, we'll see if that becomes an actual legitimate reality in terms of what that is. But a lot of the times, and obviously we've had third candidates before. I think Andrew Yang was trying to do his third party thing, and there's been other people, and it's always couched in the same kind of thing. We got to get out of two parties, kind of what you're saying. Put it on the voter, look at other options, whatever. And people will say, I think if you look at polling, everyone, hates both candidates, right? They're just like, don't like Biden, don't like Trump, don't want to vote for them. But people keep putting them in the primaries, and they keep, putting them as the nominee. And it's like nobody's looking elsewhere. And so obviously there's the role institutions play. Obviously there's the role voters play. But with third parties, they've mostly been seen as spoilers in this country. And why do you think that is, or why do we frame it that way? And how would it look a little bit different in the kind of parliamentary system that you're proposing?
So I do draw a distinction. So you've described what I refer to as the third party dilemma. And the third party dilemma is the idea that people really want more options than two. But in the system that we have, when you vote for a third party, you're ultimately voting against interests. So most people are familiar with the term spoiler. I needed to create a term to capture another essential dynamic. A spoiler arises if you vote for a third party candidate to the left of the Democrat, and the effect then is to essentially throw support to your least favored major party candidate. If you vote for somebody to the left of the Democrat, you're taking support away from the Democrat. Remember, the goal is to keep your side together, fracture the opposition. So when you support a third party candidate, you're fracturing your own side. You're punishing yourself, and you're supporting the other major party candidate. Or conversely, you vote for somebody to the right of the Republican, and you throw support to the Democrat. The election 2000 is a reasonably good place to illustrate these propositions. You've got Bush against Gore, right? And you have Ralph Nader, who, you might say is to the left of Gore, and took enough votes away to harm Gore's electoral prospects. And you had Pat Buchanan, who was to the right of Bush, right? And people who supported him were potentially operating against Bush, although there's a weird dynamic that occurred in Florida where it actually ended up being Pat Buchanan, who ultimately could have thrown the election in Bush's direction, but that has to do with a strange ballot in a particular county in the Gulf Coast of Florida. We could talk about that if you'd like. But there's another problem, which is sometimes, and RFK Jr. will fall into this category, possibly, although you never know. Maybe John Anderson fell into this category. Sometimes a candidate will try to come up the middle, and will risk pulling votes from both sides, rendering the outcome kind of a roll of the dice for the most significant office in the United States, arguably the world. And so I call that a randomizer, right? A randomizer is somebody who in a two-party system threatens to take votes from both sides, and then the winner is the is not somebody who necessarily has majority support. I mean, you can look at Bill Clinton, right? He wins with 43% of the vote. We've had similar results in other elections where the person who wins the election doesn't capture a majority of the vote. Now, of course, the ultimate decision is a majority in the Electoral College, at least since the only two elections that have gone to the House of Representatives. So the problem is that just wishing for a third party doesn't create a space for third parties. So it's not that voters aren't behaving responsibly. That's not the reason we don't have third parties. The reason we don't have third parties is because we don't have institutions that create a mechanism that allows them to thrive. That's the problem. And I have to say, one of the things that people don't quite understand is recognizing that we are in a problematic institutional environment will not get us out of that problematic institutional environment. Recognizing you're in a bad situation won't get you out of it unless you change the environment, right? So one of the central lessons of my book is that we need to confront profound institutional choices that need to be changed if we're going to get out of our two-party dynamic and create the possibility for a thriving multi-party democracy. Simply wanting it to happen will not make it happen. We have to confront vital choices that were made very early on in our history, and we have to correct course by changing institutions to allow third parties to thrive if we're going to come out of the third-party dilemma and come up with a multi-party solution, which is the goal of this book, to show how we can come up with a multi-party solution to the third-party dilemma.
So there's a really wonderful graph you have in your book, and is this piece of it that you talk about, this is still in the third party here. There's every generation, we'll say 20, 30 years, we see these ideological shifts, right? And your claim is that having more parties, third party, fourth, fifth, all these different parties, and expanding electoral reform would help with these ideological shifts. So, in the book, I'm looking at the book now. If you look at, I'll just go back to 2004 because that's 20 years ago. There's the median Democrat. And 70% of Republicans were consistently conservative. You fast forward to 2017, and it's 97% of Democrats are more liberal than the median Republican. Right? It's a complete shift. It's hard to describe here unless people see it. But in 20 years, 30 years, especially in the past 20, 30 years, because of probably I think. Digital media and how we get our information and all these things. We're getting things much faster, lots of different things coming at us than when you read 3 newspapers every day. So, and the point is that there's this shift between Republicans and Democrats from, what the average Democrat looked like in 94, 97, and what the average Democrat looks like today, vice versa, Republicans for sure. How would a third party, so if we have this reform, how would other parties help with ideological shifts? Because in 20 years, in 2044, it's going to look different, ostensibly. So how would more parties help with these evolving shifts? Would it be that parties would be less ideological, or that would be not the majority? You might have very strong ideological parties, but that there's something there, and everything kind of offsets it, so that way these main parties aren't just listening to the most loud parts of their party. How would this multiple parties kind of thing help with the ideology?
So let me try to see if I can capture the visual of that really important table, which is actually from the Pew Research Center, and then answer the question. So what that Pew Research graphic is showing is that from the early to mid 90s until 2017, when that graphic was produced, what you had was overlapping ideological positioning of Democrats and Republicans. If you go back further, to the 1950s, the overlap was overwhelming. In fact, there was a American Political Science Association study, a critique of the two-party system. It's hard for people to imagine this. In the early 50s, the major criticism was that the parties didn't give voters meaningful choice because they were too similar. And in fact, if you look at the 1952 election, both parties courted the same head of their ticket, Dwight D. Eisenhower. That's unimaginable in the era in which we're presently residing. What that graphic is capturing is that some degree of overlap continues even into the early information age, but then we end up with an increasingly bimodal distribution instead of what most people can visualize a standard distribution, or what statisticians will call a Gaussian distribution. Looks like a bell curve. Imagine instead that you've got two bell curves that overlap in the centers, but they're moving further and further apart. And that's what the Pew Research Center is capturing, is that the modes of the two parties, as opposed to a single bell curve, it is bimodal, right? The modes for the two parties are moving further and further apart in the information age. And honestly, 2017, it has only gotten worse. In fact, substantially so in the intervening years since that graph was published. So you're absolutely right that if we project ahead on the sort of the pattern that we're observing today, it becomes even more so. Now, there's a couple of things to say about why that's so. One has to do with the fact that we have better sorting ideologically than historically we did. So Southern Democrats are no longer Southern Democrats. They're Republicans. Rockefeller Republicans, kind of the liberal wing of the older GOP, they're no longer Republicans. They're Democrats. So we have better sorting, but that doesn't capture the dynamic. Even if we take that sorting into account, there's no question that the centers or modes of the two parties are moving further and further apart. Now, one of the challenges here is that in a two-party system, you have to make a choice. Which team are you on? And the goal, as I've said, is to keep your side together and fracture the opposition. And the problem with that is that both sides come to realize they can't afford, because of the close margins in our elections, to give up any of their base. They can't give up any of their constituency. Because if they alienate any of their constituents, they risk throwing major political outcomes to the other side. The presidency, who controls the Senate, who controls the House. And so you end up with this dynamic where each side is struggling because on the one hand, they're trying to hold on to those that are centrists in their party, but they also are trying to not alienate and throw off those that are increasingly strident members of the base. And that's helping to drive the wedge between these two parties. Most political scientists, we all sort of envision this idea, liberal to conservative, a single line with two major candidates that converge on the center. Actually, that was a notion popularized in a book by an economist named Anthony Downs, written in 1957. And in 1957, for reasons I've described, that was actually intuitive. The parties were converging on the center. Today, that's no longer the case. Most political scientists think that the better way to frame our politics isn't one line, liberal to conservative on policy, but you could think of it as like a four-frame window, right? North, you've got kind of culture and identity conservatism, and then toward the bottom, a more open global, sort of identity, and you end up with four boxes: conservative on culture and identity and on public policy to the right. That's kind of traditional Republicans. Liberal on economic policy, but conservative in cultural and identity. That's kind of populist, or a conventional understanding of populist. Liberal, both on policy and identity, that's kind of traditional Democrat. And conservative on economics, liberal on social issues, that's conventional libertarian. And if you have a multi-party system, you allow the parties not to be beholden to the most extreme demands of their base. Within the Democratic Party, there's clearly two parties at a minimum. There's the general Democratic Party, and there's a progressive party. They would break into two parties. Within the Republican Party, there's clearly at least two parties. The general GOP, and there's either we can call it America First or MAGA. There's probably a Green Party. There might be a Libertarian Party. And if you allowed these parties to emerge, you could have different combinations in that two-dimensional space that I've described without any one party being absolutely committed to the most extreme demands of its strident base. You could have different combinations. And we see that in coalition-based systems. Coalition-based systems with proportional representation, not all systems do it well, and we can talk about that. That's one of the reasons I take people on the world tour. But those systems tend to motivate more turnout, they tend to produce more responsive government, and they tend to create less fixed divisions that are permanently entrenched with two parties.
Yeah, for me, we'll talk about the coalition bit because I think it's really important. Because we can talk about how other countries do it, but how it might look here in the U.S. because we're the third largest, or I should say the third most populous country in the world. I think that's still right. India, China, and then us.
That may be right. I think
that's right.
That resonates. I'm not 100% sure, but that strikes me as probably right.
Yeah, we're right there, top 3, top 5, somewhere there. And it's just a big jump from 2 to 3, right? It's 1.4 billion at least, and then 330 million is a big jump. But either way, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how the U.S. could potentially do a coalition, because for me, yeah, I mean, I think like most people, it's getting pretty exhausting now having a party beholden to 20 members or something because we're going to shut down the government because we didn't like a bill or something like that. I mean, it's just getting really frustrating, and and people check out. They don't want to be a part of it. They don't want to vote, and I get it. I think it's a good thing to vote for sure, and I encourage people to do it, but I get why people are frustrated. So I think I would love to see everyone have to work together. That would be very nice because it's like, okay, you can't sabotage things anymore. So we'll get there. But I guess real quick, there's a few things here. So I want to talk to you about gerrymandering because that's if you can believe it, that's a big passion of mine in terms of combating it. I think it's super essential. And
of mine.
Yeah, really, really, really essential. It's something that I get really fired up about.
Well, you should. And I'll just say my proposals fix that problem.
I liked a lot of what you had to say about it. Yeah. Okay, so but just real quick, we talked about it, so we can just kind of just briefly kind of skim it here, just for context, I think. So we talked about election of 1800. We don't have to kind of go over that, but that was pivotal. You can talk about how it was pivotal and all the pieces as it leads up to the 1820s, where we kind of get the creation of the Democratic Party. That's where we have the kind of fusion ticketed voting coming. And then you have this Whig Party, which is really interesting. I mean, I think, it dies out, and then I think you kind of get the Republican Party with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So what's the kind of just kind of the overview of those kind of 60 years of basically what's the progression of how we've tried or how we've done voting or how we've dealt with parties? The Whig Party obviously was really, I mean, there's presidents that have been elected from the Whig Party. So, that's why I'm mentioning it, because we've done sort of different things at a kind of precarious time very early on in the country. And then the parties we know today, of course, they have changed in terms of ideology, but Republican, Democrat, really since 1860. To kind of give us that kind of brief summary there. So
that's a great synopsis of key elements of that history that you've described. What's interesting that a lot of Americans might not realize, not only do we have the longest written constitution of any nation in the world, but we also have the longest two parties continuous of any nation in the world, right? Really, the Democratic Party is largely the handiwork of Martin Van Buren because of his frustration with the outcome of the election of 1824, which was the second and only other election not to succeed in the Electoral College, to be thrown to the House of Representatives. And it produced what what supporters of Andrew Jackson, who had a plurality of votes, called a corrupt bargain, where John Quincy Adams basically made Henry Clay Secretary of State, got Henry Clay's support. This was called the corrupt bargain because a lot of people thought that the Secretary of State position was kind of a throughway to the highest office in the land. And Martin Van Buren, who was really a brilliant political strategist, went about creating a genuine national party, the Democratic Party. And one of the key features of that was to avoid controversial positions, and basically, through patronage and these sorts of things, and not taking a strong stand, for example, on slavery. Right? You could have Southern Democrats, and you could have Democrats in the North, and you had the Whig Party, and ultimately. The Republican victory in 1860, the Whigs were dying on the vine throughout the 1850s anyway. But the nail in the coffin, of course, was Abraham Lincoln's 1860 election. There was no space left for this alternative party that was clearly anti-slavery, but some were accommodationist, right? Just sort of like, don't let it expand further. Some were abolitionists, right? There was less space for that party. When the Republicans ultimately succeeded with the election of Abraham Lincoln, and by the end of that election, you have this really strange national unity party with Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson running together, a Southern Democrat and a Republican, together under the banner of the National Unity Party. That's the other example of this odd marriage. But once we realized that didn't work out too well, and tragically Lincoln's assassinated, and this leads to real failures with Reconstruction and so forth. But ultimately, we end up with these two parties, right? We had two parties previously. It's not the first time we've had two parties. We've had two parties really throughout that dominated. In transitional periods, we've had more than two parties, but when the dust settles, because of the nature of our system, we end up with two parties, and we've basically had two parties, the same two parties, dominating really since then, which is a remarkable thing. And we've talked about realignments and so forth. So that, again, that's an overview of a lot of history. Yeah. But it does explain how we got to a place with two pretty solidly entrenched parties. The other development that you and I hadn't mentioned is that the early 1840s was sort of the first time that Congress replaced what had been a system in some states of at-large elections, multiple member elections for the House of Representatives, with an insistence on single district elections. And that has to do with the battle between the Whigs and the Democrats. And that has carried forward and became entrenched in a statute in 1967, a federal statute that requires that we have single member districts. But by then, only two states didn't have single member districts, one of which happened to be Hawaii, which required some interesting mapping. But now we have single member districts, and that further entrenches the two parties. So look, the parties, you can say they can hate each other, but there's a symbiosis, right? There's a symbiotic relationship. They both thrive on there being a two-party system, right? So they can agree on mechanisms that make it more difficult for third parties to thrive.
Yeah. Before gerrymandering, there was this piece that you talked about, which really kind of, I don't know, I think it was I don't know if it's a novel thing, but it just jumped off the page for me. It was sort of novel for me. Was you were talking about, you mentioned earlier about our kind of misadventures with dealing with race and gender throughout our history, of course. And, we've made considerable progress, probably too slow, but, we've made progress. There's still issues out there. you talk about this interesting dichotomy of having a constitution of positive rights versus negative rights. And that jumped out to me because, I think that there's what is this, like a positive and negative injunction, right? It's something where it's like, are you saying that you have a right to not do something or to not have something? Are you having a right to have something or something for your flourishing or for your success? And I was really struck by this. Could you talk about the Constitution and this kind of way in seeing these things of having positive rights versus these kind of negative rights, and kind of how the Constitution started or was, and then how as we've made these amendments, or what are we up to, 27, I think, how we sort of changed that a bit. Just give us that kind of framing a bit. It was very interesting.
So it is interesting, and I think most people don't really understand it. The different premise of our Constitution in this way versus the premise of other constitutions that in many respects sound better, but ultimately both of them are just problematic in different ways. A negative rights and a positive rights constitution. They both are problematic. They just manifest their problems differently. So we have the framers were sort of founded on this notion of small L liberalism. And what I mean by that is basically the government has power and individuals have the capacity to limit the exercise in certain circumstances of governmental powers. The original constitutional design really didn't say a lot about rights. When we think of the Bill of Rights, that was the first act of Congress. I mean, actually, that is kind of a tension between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. It was sort of an accommodation, right? Okay, we'll go along with this, but the first order of business ought to be a Bill of Rights. And actually, Hamilton was opposed to a Bill of Rights because he thought that articulating specific rights would imply powers the government didn't actually possess, right? Anything that wasn't limited was granted. And the idea of the Constitution was there were very limited conferrals of power on the federal government. So Hamilton had this kind of counterintuition by modern lights of, if you articulate rights, it might actually limit rights by negatively implying greater governmental powers, right? Against rights that are not specified. But nonetheless, the Anti-Federalists kind of won that round. And we articulate certain rights against the government, but they're negative rights. These are things the government cannot do. It was not a premise of our Constitution that we have the government committing to doing things for its citizens. If you look at constitutions that are of more recent vintage, even in countries that are deeply problematic, look at South Africa, for example. Look at Russia. The written constitutions about you have a right to housing, you have a right to subsistence, you have a right to food, you have a right to shelter. And then if you go to Johannesburg or you go to Cape Town and you look at the shanty towns, you think, wait a minute. You've got all these articulated positive rights. It can't mean that. It can't mean that you get to build a shanty and that you don't have a genuine, you don't have what most people would regard as, a home with running water, proper plumbing, proper heating systems, proper cooling systems, right? Genuine access to foods and robust markets. The problem on the other side is that articulating positive rights doesn't translate into committing political will to actually backing up those commitments financially and otherwise, to actually making good on the promises. So on one side, the negative rights constitution basically implies that you have to keep chasing abuses of rights and articulating what it is you cannot do. And it's just a never-ending game. You can't do this. Okay, I'll try it that way. You can't do this, right? It's a little bit like what's the game in an amusement park where you whack-a-ball? It's a little bit like whack-a-ball, right? You hit down one and it pops up somewhere else. You have to hit. It's a never-ending dynamic in a negative rights constitution. The problem on the positive rights constitution side is it requires a constant political commitment to make good on the promises, and frankly, that requires commitments to allocate resources in the direction of those in greater need, that's really hard to achieve because those in greater need tend to have less access to the levers of power. Both systems are bad, but they manifest themselves in different ways.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting way of looking at something that we just kind of say, oh, or Bill of Rights, or oh, this is our constitutional rights. But thinking about, well, how? What kind of rights, and what does that look like, and how does that play out? I think I have many philosophical questions to follow up with, but I'll park the bus there for now.
well, let me just follow up with one because it's just directly relevant to the larger conversation. A lot of people say all we have to do is have a right to vote. But what does that mean? Obviously, it can't mean that if you're underage you have a right to vote. It can't mean that if you're not a citizen you have a right to vote.
Right.
What are the conditions that you have to demonstrate in order for that right to be triggered? And then you're just begging the question in a certain sense whether you have a right to vote, right? You're just coming back, you're coming full circle to whether the scheme that we have is a negative rights. You can't deny people the right to vote based on age, below the specified age, race, gender, right? But it can't mean that simply having a pulse implies that you get to vote.
Oh, yeah. That's right. Yeah, it's something that, again, it's a nice thing to say, and I think most people would agree with it. But then when you actually start playing it out, it's like, okay, how does this? What are the contours of this? What's the shape of this?
Right.
Which is again, it's important to consider. Okay, so gerrymandering. I'm going to flag this here. I'm going to try and stay on task here, so I don't go off on a long 45-minute diatribe here. But it's important, obviously, when we're talking about the proposed amendments you have and electoral reform and all of these things. So I just want to place it here so we can reference it. Oh man! So you can explain gerrymandering, just kind of the elementary version of what it is for some folks, but there are unfortunately terrible examples of this. So this happens on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. It's a bipartisan issue in the worst way. North Carolina had some terrible districts. They were terribly gerrymandered, and unfortunately, here in my wonderful, the best state in the Union of Maryland, has some terrible gerrymandered districts. Specifically, I'm not trying to call anybody out, but District 3, looked like, whoever drew that map looked like they had a seizure when they drew that district on the map. It was, I'd have to show a picture to listeners for you. It looks horrendous, and the other thing about that is that it crossed, literally, it's in the center part of the state, if you will. It crosses completely different urban areas. It has suburban areas. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And so anyways, so tell us kind of the kind of potted, description of gerrymandering, why we struggle with this, or don't struggle, but why we continue to persist with this. Maybe you can give some examples. Maryland might be really fun to do, or if you want, and how you can also talk about Red Map too, but what we can do to kind of legitimately fix gerrymandering and why that's important for districts and all these things.
So the term itself, gerrymandering, goes back to a very early governor of Massachusetts, who was originally he was originally an anti-federalist, and then he ultimately became governor of Massachusetts after the Constitution was ratified. And what he did was he drew up a map that more or less resembled, or at least people thought it did, a salamander, and he concentrated the other party's votes into fewer districts so that he could have lower level majority votes in more districts, spread the wealth of his party's votes across more districts. And we don't know who came up with this portmanteau that put together Carey with a hard G and salamander comes up with what today we all call it gerrymander, even though his last name was a hard G, not a soft G. And around the world, everybody knows this term, gerrymandering, right? Basically drawing districts in a way that concentrate the voting power into smaller numbers of districts so that the votes of the out party get wasted, and spreading the wealth of the party in power across more districts with closer majorities to get the benefit in single-member districts of getting more and more representation by the favored party, and that's what gerrymandering is about. And please,
can I jump in here?
Yeah.
In theory, how should it be, right? Is it just population based? Is it more based on the kind of topographical map of, like, for example, I live in Western Maryland, right? So there's a certain kind of demographic in the majority of people that live in, mountain, in Appalachia, in the mountains, small towns for the most part, et cetera. Throwing in a big city in there to kind of, rig it so that way, that throws all that. Is it kind of place-based? Is it constituent-based, population-based? How should it, in theory, work?
Well, so first of all, it is a requirement of equal protection case law that all districts have, as close as possible, equal numbers of constituents in the district. So the population question isn't the concern. The problem is you can take one person, one vote, which really means equal populations in each district, and you can draw the map lines in ways that concentrate super majorities of the disfavored party and closer majorities to the favored party. So so the one person, one vote, and there's a lot of case law about that going back to the 1960s, doesn't solve the problem of partisan gerrymandering. You made a comment that both parties play this game. To some extent, that's certainly true. It is also important for your audience to understand that Republicans have a kind of built-in advantage at playing this game. And the
How so?
Well, for a particular reason, which has to do with a tension between the Voting Rights Act and the requirements of equal protection. So the Voting Rights Act includes a principle called non-retrogression. And what that means is that you have to go through some procedures, an administrative preclearance procedure, and there's some recent case law that has complicated all of this. We don't have to get into the details. If a state draws a map that looks like it is going to compromise the representational strength of Black voters, right, with what we call minority-majority districts, the challenge, and on the equal protection side, there's a requirement for not taking race into account in specific ways. So there's a tension because to avoid non-retrogression, you kind of have to take race into account. To avoid color blindness, you have to kind of not take race into account. There's a tension between the statute and equal protection. But as it plays out on the ground, the difficulty is that because most Black voters support the Democratic Party has a little bit less capacity to manipulate Black voting districts in a way where they can spread the wealth, because by spreading the wealth, they may compromise having minority-majority districts, whereas Republicans are happy to concentrate and create minority-majority districts because that gives them the benefit of super concentrated Democratic voting districts, allowing them to spread the wealth of Republican districts. So there are some structural reasons why, although it's true that Maryland, for example, draws maps that favor Democrats, North Carolina will draw maps that favor Republicans. Writ large, it tends to be the case Republicans are better at this, not because they're smarter, although there is a particular story in 2008 in which they certainly acted as if they're smarter. But there's also a structural reason why Republicans tend to play the gerrymandering game more effectively than Democrats. The 2008 story is beautifully documented in a book, Rat Effed, written by David Daley, former Salon editor, who tells the story of how after Barack Obama's first election, Republican operatives realized that because states draw the House of Representatives districting maps, if they throw money at enough below the radar state level races, they could turn enough blue and purple states red, and then they could draw maps in a way that would make the House of Representatives maps more red. And they really thought that strategy would entrench the Republican hold on the House for 20 years. That was a little bit more ambitious, but that strategy called Red Map really was a significant move in a dynamic that's deeply problematic, which is that general election races for the House are not competitive. Instead of us choosing our representatives as a result of hyperpartisan gerrymandering, our representatives are really choosing us. And the only real competition in House races is at the primary stage. But the problem is that at the primary stage, that only helps push the parties further and further apart. Because if you're a Republican who doesn't play well enough with the base, or a Democrat that doesn't play well enough with the base of your respective parties, a challenger will come in who will. And if you're primary, that means that seat's going to be filled by somebody who's moving further apart from the other party rather than closer together. And so one of the things that gerrymandering does, especially since the red map strategy in the post-2008 election period, is to contribute to driving that wedge that, as the Pew Research graph that we've talked about demonstrates visually, is driving the parties further and further apart. And I'll just mention another dynamic that's contributing to that, that's exacerbating that, has to do with how media has changed in the information age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh man, yeah, there's so many good, stuff there.
Let me make one comment just so your readers can visualize the kind of peculiar maps that you talk about. Maryland District 3. Let me mention the famous one that made it to the Supreme Court more than once, North Carolina District 12. In an opinion by Justice O'Connor, she compares it to a Rorschach ink blot test, or a bug splattered on a windshield driving at a high speed. Right. So what she talks about in that opinion are three things that are supposed to inform districting: compactness, contiguity, and respect for political subdivisions. But the truth of the matter is that it's really hard to enforce that. And the Supreme Court, in a recent case, Rucho, has basically abandoned altogether the idea that the Supreme Court or the federal judiciary is going to check hyperpartisan gerrymandering. They've basically given states the green light to engage in this kind of hyperpartisan gerrymandering.
Oh, man.
Yeah, is right.
That's the stuff that's really... You
cannot rely on the Supreme Court to save our democracy.
Yeah, it's very... Yeah.
It's very disheartening.
Again, this is, why, for me, this is my thing. This is really, really important. I'll just say one quick thing about this. Credit where credit's due. Governor of Maryland, previously Larry Hogan, had instituted a kind of what's the name of this? Like an
independent commission.
Yeah, independent commission. So it was really evenly matched. So they had 9 people on there. It was 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 3 independents. And they were all selected from about equally from different parts of the state. Maryland's not a big state, but, was it 10, 12 million people? But they have, so there was enough folks from, Southern Maryland and, Western and Maryland, Eastern Shore and the center part of the state, kind of all over the place. So it wasn't just, 3 Democrats from Montgomery County or something. So, and they really, It was a while. It was maybe a year and a half or 2 years. I don't remember the start to finish, but they did a bunch of, I think, surveys, and they asked a bunch of questions, and they did interviews or kind of these quasi interviews and all of these things. And then they would draw up a version of a better map, district map, and then they have it for review, and et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if it was a novel thing. I don't know if, I'm sure maybe other places had done this, but I appreciate the spirit of it, which was trying to be pretty, nonpartisan, trying to do it fair. It was very transparent for people that were interested in it. And if I do recall, I do think in the last election in 22, it did get, because they were using, I think, 2020 census and everything, they did redraw it a bit. I mean, it's still somewhat problematic, but it's much better than what it was. And you can look at that compare contrast map of, what it was, in 2000 and what it was in the 2020 election. So, fair play to him and that whole process. And, still have to keep doing that. And there's other District 12 in North Carolina. I think Texas has had some pretty terrible gerrymandered districts.
States have. I mean, the reality is that, some states use commissions, but the reality is that it is our system that makes these districting maps matter so much. And if other states are doing this because they're now allowed to, the idea that we're going to get meaningful democratic reform by some states using commissions, I think isn't realistic. And really what we need to do is eliminate the incentives to engage in hyperpartisan gerrymandering, not prohibit it by saying, thou shalt not gerrymander. What we need to do is change our institutions so there isn't an incentive to continue doing this. And one of the reform proposals, my first amendment, literally eliminates incentives prospectively for gerrymandering by taking the gains of future gerrymandering away through proportionality. And I think that this is another example where we can all say, oh, we don't like hyperpartisan gerrymandering. That's not enough to end it. You have to create an institutional environment in which we no longer have incentives to engage in hyperpartisan gerrymandering.
I totally agree with you. And again, the commission's nice, but it's like a lot of other things, right? You can't have some states that, get their act together and it's great, and then we just forget about the other states. Like, it is the United States, everyone doing their own thing. I firmly agree with you. It has to be an institutional thing. Not going to probably happen with the Supreme Court, but you never know. We'll see.
You can't rely on the Supreme Court to change our institutions. We need to recognize,
I agree with that too.
as an electorate and as a citizenry, that we have to take seriously the need to evaluate our institutions, educate ourselves, and encourage key decision makers to embrace vital reforms that will allow us to thrive in a multi-party democracy.
Again, no disagreement for me. I think that's there's a lot of potential power we have, or there's a lot of ways we can do this, and I feel it just goes unused, which is unfortunate. Okay, so really quick, so you give a world tour in the book. We don't have to go through all of it. There's 3 big countries. You talk about a lot of countries, which is really interesting. Basically, different ways in which there's a kind of parliamentary system and things like that. So England, France, Germany. I'll let readers read about England and France, but I do want to focus on Germany, mostly for 2 reasons. Number one, it was my personal favorite, so I want to talk about it. And then second, I do think it is a sort of kind of model-ish of how we could do things in the U.S. So my preamble to this is, often enough, Americans like to do things their way. They don't like doing what another country does, typically, not on everything, but even down to the fact of, maybe there's a larger history of this, but, we do things, in miles instead of kilometers. We do things in feet instead of meters. Like, we just, all these things, Fahrenheit, Celsius, like, we're always different, or we try to be different, or, we have our electoral system and how we do things, and it's different. And I'm not necessarily speaking negatively about that, but we do have a resistance of, well, that's how Europe does it, or that's how Germany does it, but we're the United States, we're Americans, we don't do it that way, we do it our way. So I guess just the first kind of bit into this, and then you can talk about Germany's system. How do we kind of push against that? Because people are going to resist that. Maybe it's just good PR. Maybe you just call it something different. We Americanize it our way so people buy into it. But how do we first break against that kind of? I can imagine you can't go to somebody and you say, well, look, when you look around the world, people do it different ways. And Germany has a pretty good handle on this. And there's some really good things we could learn and maybe implement here. That seems for a lot of people dead on arrival. So yeah, how do you combat that? And then tell us about Germany's mixed member proportionality and how that works, and then how it could look in the U.S.
So let me just also mention the other countries too, just so your audience will know. So in two chapters, I take people on a virtual world tour. Chapter 5 to England, France, and Germany. Chapter 6 to Israel, Taiwan, Brazil, and Venezuela. I think I'm a pretty good tour guide, actually. It makes the book a particularly good deal.
Great, yeah.
Because I point out interesting sites, and I really believe this. I sincerely believe that if you read my book and you travel to those countries, you will enjoy your travels more. You will have a really better picture of how that nation and society works at a level that you otherwise would not. And also, it'll just make you a better tourist. You will have greater respect for their way of doing governance and democracy. And I think that's really important. I think one way to counter the intuition that we just want to be different is to say that that's fine. What I'm proposing here isn't the German system. I'm proposing an adaptation that is uniquely suited to the United States. The title of the book is the main title is Parliamentary America, but I want to emphasize America. It is Parliamentary America. It keeps vital American institutions. And one way to get past this idea that we can't learn from other nations is to start with a simple, unmistakably true premise. There is no perfect democracy. This is demonstrable both intuitively and at the level of theory. When Winston Churchill says that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others that have been tried, that actually is backed up with really brilliant social science literature and research going to impossibility theorems. There's really quite a lot to demonstrate. In fact, it's true. Every single democracy, including those on my tour, embed features that can credibly be described as anti-democratic. And that's a liberating thing, because what that means is that as we look at other systems, we are comparing imperfect alternatives. So it's not just our system that's imperfect. France's, Germany's, Israel, certainly Israel's, right? England, Taiwan, every one of these systems is imperfect. And what that means is that when you go on the tour, you're not looking for the perfect system to defeat ours. What you're looking for is a comparison of strengths and weaknesses, and then trying to figure out which of the best features of other systems we could infuse into ours, still keeping it uniquely American, still being patriotic, but making it better than it is now. We still won't be perfect, but we'll be better, right? So that's the basic idea, right? Form a more perfect union. More perfect implies not perfect, more perfect, right? There are still things to perfect. This is the beginning, a significant juncture in a process, but the process will never end. Democracy is a project. It never ends. Now, the German system has serious problems. And in fact, they have actually revised their system about a year ago, in March of 2023, because of some of the problems with it. The proposal I have avoids the problems that motivated Germany to revise aspects of its system. So the system is called Mixed Member Proportionality, and it was designed for post-World War II Germany. And the idea is they have a two-chamber legislative body. The lower chamber is called the Bundestag. The upper chamber is called the Bundesrat. You could think of those as sort of like the House of Representatives and the Senate, respectively. Sure. So when you vote as a citizen for the Bundestag, the lower chamber, like our house, you cast two ballots. One ballot is for what they call a constituency seat. That's very similar to a districted election, just like we do now. The other one is by party. In Germany, they use the party votes nationally to create party proportionality for the entire country, and they allocate the seats by state. It creates some non-trivial math problems. And the best way to see the non-trivial math problems is that up until the 2023 March reforms, they had a body that was started at 598 members that had to be inflated to 736 to make the math work. So they had a variable size lower legislative chamber. We are not going to have a variable size House of Representatives. American voters would not go for a balloon as a substitute for the House of Representatives. We have to have a fixed size. We have to know what it is in terms of numbers. Since then, what Germany has done, it is fix it at 630. There are three elements in mixed member proportionality. One of them is guaranteed seating for those who win what they call constituency seats, or we call district elections. The second one is proportionality. The German Supreme Court insisted on pure party proportionality, almost no mathematical variance. The third one is the size of the chamber. You can play with this, and in the book I talk about this. The interesting thing is you cannot satisfy all three of those criteria. It's a mathematical impossibility. Something has to give. What Germany decided will give is the guaranteed seating of constituency seats. In the American version that I propose, what we can give is pure proportionality. We don't need pure proportionality. We need what I call good enough proportionality. Good enough proportionality to break the two-party duopoly and to force coalition governance, so that instead of each party catering to its base, moving further and further away, just imagine this. Imagine voting in a campaign in which the party platform goes something like this. We are committed to these principles. There are other parties that have principles that we really disagree with, but we can do business with those folks. There are also principles that we are committed to that they share, one of which is effective democratic governance. So I know we want you to support us, but we want you to also know we can work with other parties to create a government. Imagine those campaigns as opposed to the campaigns we have now. And imagine being able to vote for candidates and parties that genuinely represent who you are. So I'm going to take another state just to give an illustration of how this works, because a lot of it will come together, including how it ends gerrymandering incentives. Washington State, like Maryland, has 10 seats, House of Representatives. So imagine that Washington, under this system, mixed member proportionality, we double the number of seats. It goes from 10 to 20. Now, in the district elections, because it's a single person representing a district for the reasons I previously described, keep your side together, fracture the opposition, you end up with two dominant parties. For the district seats, you're going to end up with two dominant parties. Let's assume for now it's Democrats and Republicans. And let's assume they each get 5 of those seats for the district elections. So there are 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, but you also have the party votes. Imagine the Democrats split, and we have the Progressive Party and the Democratic Party. The Republicans split. We have the GOP, and we have America First. And imagine that those are the 4 parties that dominate in that state. And imagine they each get 25% of the party votes. Now what we do is we say, okay, we have to make the state proportional. Turns out that the Democrats already got their 25% because they won 5 district seats. 5 out of 20 is 25%. The Republicans already got their 25%. Again, 5 out of 20 is 25%. The progressives have to pick up 5 to get their 25%. America First has to pick up its 5 to get 25%. Now, Washington sends a delegation of 5, 5, 5, and 5 over those 4 parties to Congress. What's important here is although the seated members in their districts keep the benefit of the gerrymandered seats that they got, there are no further incentives to gerrymander because proportionality takes away future gains. And as a result, you don't have to say no, don't gerrymander anymore. You have created a disincentive to gerrymander because the proportionality principle is going to take away the gains as a result of the fact that a party that gets 25% will get 25% of the seats, regardless of how the district lines going forward are drawn. And so we won't have, the math will not be as perfect as it is in a state with 10 members of the House of Representatives. You will have imperfect math because we've got states with different size coalitions. But this system will create good enough party proportionality that although two parties will get more seats than other parties, they won't get enough to dominate in the sense of getting a majority. In order to form a government, they will have to form with other parties. The Second Amendment creates the vehicle for that. Up to 5 parties in descending order of representation based on seats will negotiate a governing coalition until a majority coalition forms, at which point the pre-designated head of those tickets takes the office of president and vice president with a backstop. So we stay on a fixed calendar. We eliminate gerrymandering. It is a very American institution, not like Germany. We have our 4-year presidential term, 2-term maximum, just like we do now. It is a very American version of mixed member proportionality that doesn't ditch the Constitution and start over. It identifies the foundational mistake of the original framing that actually undermined what the framers thought they were doing, right? And it will actually create greater accountability to voters and to constituents in the House of Representatives.
It's very fascinating. I see the pull and the allure. I guess the question you were sort of mentioning there is, what happened, your very easy kind of example here, 5, 5, and 5 and 5. But, what if it was 2 and 7 and,
right.
8 and 6 and, whatever, like what would happen then in those scenarios?
Again, what I call it is good enough proportionality, right? Mm-hmm. Good enough to basically make the math work per state. Once the system's in place, there are other things we could imagine doing. The goal, go back to the subtitle. The subtitle mm-hmm. of the book is The Least Radical Means of Radically Repairing Our Broken Democracy. As I say, democracy is a mm-hmm. process, not a final product. Yeah. There are things we could do over time that actually are natural. We could imagine a further revision that allows small states to form together. So you get closer proportionality with a coalition of states to the House, even if they keep their 2 Senate seats, right? There are tweaks we could do, but we don't need to do those things to break the 2-party duopoly. The goal here is very diagnostic. Find what the problem is, the 2-party system. Come up with a remedy that breaks that and that allows a multi-party system to thrive. Once that occurs, once we're a thriving multi-party system, there's a wish list of other things that we can take on. But we don't have to do everything to solve the problem, right? What we want to do is diagnose the problem, figure out what the remedy is to that problem. There may be new problems arise we don't anticipate. Some of the things that we think will be problems might go away. One of the lessons that, I've been teaching constitutional law for a very long time, for just finished my 32nd year. One of the things that just becomes clear to me the more I think about constitutional law is that it is easier to identify a problem and fix it than it is to anticipate future problems that will arise or go away after the fix. I think the wiser course of action is to be non-hubristic, to say, let's fix this problem and then see. We might be right about problems that will arise in the future. We might be wrong. Let's wait and see what the problems are before imagining that today, in the system we have, we can anticipate everything in the future. It's better to be modest that way. Let's identify the problem that's giving rise to the crisis we're confronting. Let's fix that. Once we fix that, there will be problems. They may not look exactly like what we anticipate. In chapter 11 of my book, I talk about some of the problems that I do think we might want to go in and revisit, but they're not necessary to fix the crisis we're facing today.
How do you feel with mixed member proportionality versus ranked choice voting? I think this was Andrew Yang who kind of was like pushing for this and all that stuff, and others. It's not just him, but I think he was kind of.
He is the loudest voice. He's the loudest voice on ranked choice voting, and I think he is doing a profound disservice to the American electorate by pushing this, including his recent TED Talk. So let me tell you why. Ranked choice voting can work under limited conditions. Those conditions do not characterize our national politics, and they fail to capture the crisis that we're facing. It is not a solution to the problem he is pitching it for. So let me explain the logic of ranked choice voting. Let's go back to the
review it for listeners and for me too.
So the mechanics of it are that when you're voting for candidates, you've got a list of candidates. Instead of choosing one, you get to rank them in numerical order. So if there are 5 candidates, you rank them 1 through 5, let's say. You don't have to do all 5, but you can. And then what you do is, it's also sometimes called instant runoff voting or instant elimination voting. The candidate who gets the fewest votes gets knocked out. And then the second choice of those voters gets reallocated. Again, candidate gets the fewest votes gets knocked out. Do it again. Repeat the process until one of those candidates gets a majority. Okay. And then that candidate wins. Now, the premise of that system is a standard voter distribution or a Gaussian distribution. So again, picture a bell curve. On the horizontal axis, you've got ideology, extreme liberal to extreme conservative. On the vertical axis, you've got the percentage of voters. And the idea is that most voters are bunched as centrists in the middle. And then you've got a descending population of voters who embrace increasingly extreme ideologies to the left or right. The logic of ranked choice voting is that if you are an extreme liberal or an extreme conservative, you can rank first the most extreme candidate, rank second someone slightly less extreme, rank third somebody still less extreme, work your way toward the moderate position. The consequence of the system will yield more moderate outcomes. Here's the problem. The entire difficulty giving rise to the crisis that we face is that our voting distribution isn't that. Our voting distribution is a bimodal distribution. This goes back to the Pew graphic. It is, in fact, ironic that Andrew Yang is relying on a special election, the one that produced Mary Peltola as the victor in a special congressional election in 2022 in Alaska, under ranked choice final 4 voting. So what happened there? There were 4 candidates who got more votes in the initial balloting than anybody else. One of those candidates, Al Gross, dropped out. The 3 who advanced were Mary Peltola, a progressive Democrat, Nick Baetjer, a moderate Republican, Sarah Palin, who everybody knows, right? Because she had been McCain's vice presidential candidate, a very conservative sort of MAGA Republican, okay? Even before there was a MAGA. Okay?
Infamously.
Right? Here's what happened with ranked choice voting. Peltola and Palin got more votes than Baetjer, who drops out, and head-to-head Peltola beats Palin. It turns out that if enough Palin voters had literally just stayed home, Palin would have gotten fewer votes. She would not have knocked out Nick Baetjer. And in a head-to-head contest, the data show that Baetjer would then have defeated Peltola. Palin voters were punished simply for showing up and voting sincerely. And the election produced the exact same result that a traditional primary would have produced because of the bimodal distribution. In a head-to-head contest, Baetjer would have defeated Peltola, but if it's just Peltola against Palin, Peltola defeats Palin. It is ironic and mistaken and confused to claim that that election demonstrates the strength of ranked choice voting, and this is not a statement against Peltola. It's a statement against the system. If the goal of ranked choice voting is to produce moderated and centrist outcomes that can only work with a standard distribution, the problem that's giving rise to the crisis we face is that's what we don't have. We have a bimodal distribution. And so ranked choice voting is the wrong reform. It can work at local levels of government where you are more likely to have a standard distribution. It is not the solution to our national politics, and it can even thwart centrist outcomes at the local level in certain instances, including the example Yang is using to demonstrate the opposite. And let me just say, this is not speculative. I'm not the one who did the studies. There are published studies by respected political scientists who have crunched the data and demonstrated that this story that he is telling is wrong.
Yeah, it's like a lot of his ideas. And I don't want to pick on Yang. I think he's a great guy.
Oh, I'm happy to have you do that.
I think he's a nice guy.
He is a nice guy.
I just think the ideas are very underdeveloped. I think they don't work nationally. And, I think maybe his branding's good, but I think that I will say that for people that have more flexible and pragmatic approaches, don't get as good PR. And so people listen to what's out there. So, Yang's got the cool kind of, thing going. And, it makes a lot of sense and it pulls on your priors and we need more of this. And so people entertain it for a bit. But I think when you really kind of, bear down on it, it's like this stuff is not terribly, deep or profound. And it also doesn't really get you the places you want to get. So, that's not to necessarily pick on him, but I think that we definitely need better ideas to kind of fix some of the problems. There's three questions and quick questions here that I want to end on, so we can take them sort of briefly. Okay, we talked about the House, expanding it to 870 members. We've kind of covered gerrymandering, the impact of the MMP from the kind of sort of German style. So this is probably, I think you say this in the book, probably the most controversial. So, this parliamentary presidency, right, about removing power from voters at ballots to party leaders. And, even when I read that, I started getting really tense. I was like, oh God, that sounds like a terrible idea. And then the kind of party proportionality, which you sort of already explained, and then removal. So there's, electing there and then removal piece of that. So explain to us this kind of electing the president, and then in the cases of removing, this kind of that Third Amendment.
So I'm gonna press back on one characterization where you describe the Second Amendment as removing power from voters. I think that's mistaken. I think my proposal empowers voters. It gives voters more power. But again, this requires education. Are voters empowered when faced with a choice between Donald Trump, who is literally sitting as a criminal defendant in a courtroom in the least significant of the four sets of indictments that are facing him, where he will get the nomination and could win. The data show that he's more likely to win, at least today, based on today's polling. Or voting for Joe Biden, who will be the oldest president and who a lot of people are, frankly, unexcited about as a candidate. Does that empower you as a voter to make a choice between two candidates, neither of whom satisfy you? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the mistake...
nobody's happy with our decisions.
I think the mistake that people make is to think casting a ballot between choices that you have no control over, really, is empowering. What is empowering is controlling what the choices are. And if we had a genuine system of multi-party competition, you would be empowered as a voter because you would contribute to the choice sets not only of the candidates, but of which parties might form part of the government to moderate the parts of the platform of the party that succeeds in forming the coalition in ways that are favorable to you, because the parties you support will influence the platform, who serves in the cabinet, and who gets particular judicial posts. That's empowering. You are more powerful when you can genuinely influence the direction, the structure, and the content of the government than when you have a choice to vote between two candidates, neither of whom you actually like. So power doesn't come from a final ballot over choices you don't approve. Power comes from defining what the choices are and influencing the nature of the final product. I am convinced that my proposal empowers voters in a significant way. I'm sure that if you went to Germany or you went to other systems that have effective systems of proportional representation and parliamentary selection, non-hyper-fragmented systems, right? And you ask them, here's what we'll do. We will take away the ability of the parliament to choose the head of government. You will vote for that person directly, but you'll only get to vote for the districted seat. I'll bet you get almost zero takers. And that's not speculative. The fact of the matter is that the United States' two-party presidential system, despite being the oldest written constitution in the world, has been replicated literally nowhere. We have exported democracy. We have never exported our form of democracy because it does not work. Whereas the German MMP system has been replicated again and again and again, benignly to meet unique situational needs. Not because those voters aren't empowered, but because they are. So I think this is about education. It is vital that American voters learn and open their eyes to the idea that we can actually gain knowledge from other systems around the world. That doesn't mean plug and play. I'm not suggesting we take Germany and make it ours. I am suggesting every system of democratic governance is flawed in a significant way, but that doesn't mean we can't do better. It doesn't mean that we can't make ours a better system. Democracy is a process, not a product. We can improve our system and empower voters, but people need to understand that empowerment is about crafting the choices, not simply making a selection of choices that we are dissatisfied with.
So my last question here is, how do we do it? So we did not talk about the Senate. You don't talk about the Senate that much in the book, which is interesting. And so it's
I do. And I give them one additional power, which is to set party qualification thresholds. I suggest that over time in my system, although two parties will dominate these district elections, different combinations of two parties will dominate in different parts of the country. That happened with the Farmers Party, for example, which actually elected governors and senators. We will end up over time with a multi-party Senate, and I give suggestions about how we can actually improve the Senate, but again, least radical means, right? Fixing the Senate won't solve the problem, but once we become a functional multi-party democracy, there are things we can take on with the Senate. Right. And I talk about them in a later chapter, chapter 11 of the book. Yeah.
So I guess give us the 2-minute Max Stearns vision for how we get a parliamentary America.
So there's a couple of different ways. First of all, let me just say, I am not a politician. I will never run for office. I'm a law professor. I love my day job. I wrote this book because it became clear to me that we are in a crisis and that the vast majority of proposals don't recognize the root cause of the crisis, and they're giving failing remedies that will not fix the crisis, could not be adopted, or both. I wrote the book because I wanted people to understand how we got here And I want them to understand there is a solution that will fix the crisis. And because it leaves every sitting member of the House and Senate and incumbent in the district or state actually has the capacity to be adopted. How might this come about? Imagine that we actually had a constitutional convention, which we've never had, although we came within one or two states in the 60s and 80s, that starts throwing out proposals, most reform proposals, ranked choice voting, multi-member district, term limits. They are unemployment acts for sitting members of Congress. That's what they translate to. The whole purpose of those amendments is to get rid of sitting members of Congress in favor of more moderate congresspersons. Mine is the only proposal that lets every sitting member of Congress in the House and Senate keep their jobs in their gerrymandered districts, no less, but adds another cohort to the House that breaks the two parties' stranglehold on our politics. It allows Congress to come back and say, you know what, you got these ideas. We can fix this with 3 amendments, okay, that will actually end the crisis and create a thriving multi-party democracy. You may not like these members of Congress. I may not like these members of Congress. That's okay. Let them become the heroes of democracy. Let their legacy be, you know what, we fixed it. and that's okay, as an act of self-preservation, because the other proposals are designed to force them out of their jobs. What we need to do is educate the American public. There is a better way forward. And we have to get enough members of Congress to begin to see it too, so that this becomes part of the ether of our conversation, which is overwhelmed by misunderstandings and misdiagnoses. This is my first step. The book is only out as of March. I want to encourage your audience to buy the book, to read the book, and to give it to their friends. It will be an audiobook available on all platforms as of June 4th. To listen to the book, if that's your preferred way of reading, it happens to be one of mine. We have to educate the citizenry. I have done lots of events. People can listen to this. They can go to my Blind Spot blog and see a few dozen other places where I've given talks like this, and begin the process of educating people. I don't know when we will hit the inflection point. I can't make that prediction as a law professor, okay? In which we will absolutely confront the need for vital change. We're in a crisis now, but that can linger for a long time. There's a wonderful book called How Democracies Die by Ziblatt and Levitsky that talks about the idea that most people think constitutional crises are an event, like a military coup, but that's not true. They can linger for decades. It is associated with a gradual erosion of democratic norms. This is what we are experiencing. Okay? And citizens need to learn this. They need to understand this. And we need to change the national conversation so that people recognize we can come out of this a thriving multi-party democracy, but not by wishful thinking. We have to take on the challenge of revisiting basic assumptions and pushing for institutional change.
That's very well said, and I wholeheartedly agree. I think your book is wonderful. I do highly recommend it. It does feel, instead of just people wanting or wishing for change, here's some ways to do it, and it does. I think we have to get out of the business of, this kind of constitutional worship, and that's not un-American. It's just pragmatic. And how do we adjust it and change it and tweak it and fix it? And so there's, people are already seeing that. They're seeing the faults of all these things, and they're like, well, this is always the same, or all these things. And we just have to, be a little bit more daring, I would say. And that's certainly what you're doing. Max, thanks so much for coming on. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. It was super thoughtful, really, really illuminating. I really enjoyed it. So big thanks for coming on.
Well, Xavier, thank you so much for having me on your show. And I really enjoyed getting into some depth with you on these really important questions.
Yes, for sure.